I have been waiting my entire life to feel ready. And I am 80 years old, and I have never once felt ready. And the understanding of what the waiting was actually for arrived, not as a relief, but as the particular and quietly devastating recognition of a man who has spent most of his life solving the wrong problem. My name is Robert. I'm 80 years old, and what I want to tell you today is not about the things I waited to do, though I will tell you about those, but about what the waiting was protecting me from. Because the protecting is the part I did not understand for 78 years. And the understanding of it is the most important thing I have left to say. I need to begin with the pattern, because the pattern is what the individual instances belong to. And individual instances, told without the pattern, sound like ordinary procreation, like the common and unremarkable tendency to delay unpleasant or difficult things that most people recognize in themselves without finding it particularly significant. What I am describing is not that. What I am describing is a sustained and comprehensive relationship with the future theaterganized. My entire interior life around the premise that the present moment was insufficient for the thing being contemplated, and that a later moment, a readier moment, a more prepared and more certain and more adequate moment was available just ahead and worth waiting for. I believe this about the future with a consistency and a thoroughness that I can only describe as faith. And the faith was wrong, and the wrongness of it is what I have been sitting with since I began to understand it, which was not nearly as long ago as it should have been. I grew up in a mid-sized city in Indiana in the 1950s and 1960s, the second of 3 sons, in a family that was stable and genuinely loving, and that had, in its stability, a particular quality of caution that I absorbed before I had any ability to assess whether the absorbing was serving me. My father was a careful man. I want to say that with the fullness of what careful means, because careful is not the same as fearful, and my father was not afraid. Exactly. But he was a man who moved through the world with a consistent and thorough attention to the ways things could go wrong, and a corresponding preference for the action that minimized the possibility of the going wrong over the action that maximized the possibility of the going right. And those are not the same orientation, and they produce very different lives. He was an accountant, my father, and he brought to the family's life the same precise and risk-averse attention that he brought to his professional work. The sense that the right move was the careful move, the well-considered move, the move made only after the alternatives had been examined and the potential outcomes assessed and the uncertainties reduced to the minimum that circumstances permitted. He was not wrong exactly, and the life he built on those principles was solid and securing, gave his 3 sons a stability that I am genuinely grateful for. But stability built on the consistent avoidance of risk is also, I understand now, stability built on the consistent avoidance of certain kinds of possibility, and the avoidance, practiced long enough and thoroughly enough, becomes a disposition, a way of relating to the future that feels like wisdom and functions more like a wall. I absorbed it. I absorbed it the way children absorb the primary dispositions of the people who raise them, not as a lesson, but as the texture of how a thoughtful person moves through the world. And I carried it forward into my own life with a complete tuned consciousness of someone who does not know they are carrying a thing, because a thing has always been present and has always felt simply like who they are. I was a good student, a very good student. And the goodness at school was the first arena in which the waiting showed itself in a way I can identify in retrospect. Because being a good student, in my particular case, was not primarily about the love of learning, though the love of learning was genuine and present, but about the safety of still learning position, the position in which you are preparing for thieving rather than doing the thing, and in which the not doing it is not a failure, but a stage, a reasonable and expected interim between the current state and the eventual doing. School is the institution most perfectly designated for someone who is waiting to feel ready, because school is organized around the premise that readiness is the product of sufficient preparation. And sufficient preparation is always, by definition, not yet complete. I finished my undergraduate degree in mathematics in 1966 and did not immediately do anything with it, which I explained to myself and to my family as the reasonable pause of a young man deciding what he wanted to do with his life, and which was, I understand now, the first major instance of the pattern in its adult form. I had several things I could have done. I had an aptitude for teaching, and had been told so by people whose opinions I respected. I had an interest in actuarial work that the mathematics degree made accessible. I had a vague but genuine desire to do something with writing, which had been present since I was a teenager, and which I had been treating as the kind of desire that responsible adults manage rather than pursue, but which was real and which was not, at 22, completely beyond the realm of possibility. I did not pursue any of them. Enrolled in a master's program in mathematics, which was a way of continuing to prepare while the deciding happened, and I told myself the master's degree would clarify things, would produce the readiness that the bachelor's degree had apparently not yet produced. The master's degree did not produce the readiness. It produced another year of preparation and a credential and a mild increase in the options available to me, and I enrolled in a doctoral program which will surely produce the readiness. And the doctoral program produced a dissertation and a degree and a position teaching mathematics at a university in Ohio, and the position was good and stable, and used the credential that degree had produced, and was, in almost every respect, exactly the kind of thing me father's careful orientation toward the world would have identified as Therite moved on. It was not what I had wanted. Even to say that clearly, not as a complaint about the career, which was genuinizing in many ways, and which I am not simply dismissing from the distance of 80 years, but as the honest account of a man who had, at 22, a desire that was real, and that he had spent the better part of a detail preparing himself out of, extending the preparation until the original desire had been managed into something that could coexist with the safer choice without producing the friction that acting on the desire would have produced, the friction of uncertainty and exposure and the possibility of attempting something you genuinely wanted and discovering that the wanting was better than having. That last part is important, and even to spend some time on it, because I think it is the least obvious part of what I am trying to describe, and the most essential to understanding why waiting was not simply procrastination, but something with its own internal logic, its own coherent, if ultimately counterproductive reason for existing. The thing I wanted, at 22, was to write. Not to teach mathematics or to become an actuary or to do any of the things that the mathematics degree made sensible and accessible, but to write, to do the work that I had been doing in the margins of my notebooks since I was 15, and that produced in me, when I was doing it, the specific and complete feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing that nothing else I had tried produced with the same consistency. He wanted to write, and I did not pursue it. And I told myself I was not ready, that I needed more experience and more knowledge and more of the preparatory material that would make the writing, when I finally did it, as good as it needed to be. The truth, which I did not understand at 22, and did not fully understand until considerably later, was that the not readiness I felt about the writing was not about preparation. It was about the specific and particular exposure that the writing represented, the exposure of being the kind of person who tries to do the thing they genuinely want to do, who puts the interior life out into the world in the form of work, who can be assessed not for competence at a task they have been trained for, but for the quality of the most personal and interior thing they produce, and whose failure if they fail, is not a failure of preparation or application, but a failure of the self, of the interior, of the thing they actually are when the professional credential and the academic achievement are not available as the primary evidence of their worth. The writing was too close to the self. That is what I was waiting to feel ready for. And the readiness I was waiting for was the readiness to be exposed in that specific way. And the readiness never came, because readiness of that kind does not come from preparation, is not the product of sufficient credential or sufficient experience or sufficient anything that can be acquired in advance. It is a condition that only becomes available through the doing of the thing, through the exposure itself, through the experience of putting the interior out into the world and surviving whatever the world does with it. And the waiting for it to arrive before the doing is waiting for something that cannot arrive by. That root dot. I taught mathematics at the university for 31 years. I was a good teacher, genuinely good at it, and the goodness gave me something real, and I am not dismissing it. But I routined the margins the whole time. I kept journals, extensive journals, from the first year of the teaching until the last. And I wrote essays that I did not submit anywhere, and stories that I did not show to anyone, and a novel, an actual novel, that I finished in 1987, and that I revised for 2 years, and that I then put in a drawer because I was not ready to submit it, was not ready for the exposure of the submission. And that stayed in the drawer for 23 years until I finally submitted it in 2010, and it was rejected by everyone who saw it, and I sat with the rejection and understood, sitting with it, that their rejection was not the catastrophe I had been protecting myself from for 40 years, but simply a piece of information, simply the world's response to a piece of work, and that I had spent 40 years of my life protecting myself from a piece of information. I want to tell you about the conversation I waited to have, because the waiting in the professional life is easier to understand in its mechanism and its cost, and the waiting in the personal life is, I think, more relevant to more people and more painful to account for, because the personal waiting has different stakes and different costs, and the costs accrue differently across the years. My wife's name is Margaret, and we've been married for 52 years. And the conversation I waited to have with her is a conversation that should have happened in the first decade of our marriage, and that happened finally, partially and imperfectly, and with the full weight of the years it had not happened in our 23rd year. And I want to tell you what the conversation was, and what the waiting for it cost, because I think the telling is the honest part of the accounting. I met Margaret in 1969, when I was 25 and she was 23, and I recognized from very early in our relationship that she was someone I loved and someone I wanted to spend my life with. And I also recognized from equally early in the relationship that kind of closeness I wanted with her required me to bring myself to their relationship in a way that I had not been bringing myself to anything, require the same exposure and the same willingness to put the interior out into the world that the writing required, and that the stakes in the relationship were even higher than in the writing, because the assessment I was risking was not a professional one, but the assessment of the person I most wanted to be known by. I proposed to Margaret in 1971, and she accepted. And we were married, and I loved her, and I continued, across years of the marriage, to present to her the version of myself that I understood to be the safest version, the competent and reliable and affectionate version, that did not include the full account of the fears and the desires and the interior life that I was keeping in the journal rather than bringing into the marriage. I did not do this consciously. I want to say factually, because conscious withholding is a different and more deliberate act than what I was doing, which was the automatic and unexamined continuation of habit of not bringing the interior forward that had been the organizing of it of my entire life. I was not keeping things from Margaret. I was keeping things in the waiting place. The same place I kept the novel, and the desire send the writing. The place where things went when they were not yet ready to be exposed. And the waiting place was so thoroughly organized and so long established that I sometimes forgot things were in it at all. Margaret knew something was in it. This is what she told me in the conversation that finally happened in 1994, the 23rd year of the marriage, the year our youngest child left. For college and the house became quiet enough that the interior space of the marriage was more audible than it had been when the high management of 3 children and a full professional life was providing the ambient noise. She told me she had always felt, not always. She was careful about the word, but often, like she was talking to a version of me that was slightly to the left of where I actually was. Like there was a slight but consistent offset between the person she was in the room with and the person who was actually in the room, and that the offset had been small enough to be almost invisible and present enough to be felt, and that she had spent 23 years, not quite, naming it because the naming required the conversation that she was having now. And the conversation required her to say that the marriage she had built with me was real and was good and was also not quite what she had hoped for, which is a hard thing to say to someone you love and have been with for 23 years. I heard her. I want to say that because there are conversations like this one where the hearing is not the granted result even of the conversation happening, where the defenses are still present and the hearing is technically occurring without the real receiving. And this was not one of those times. I heard her in the full sense, heard her with the specific and painful recognition of someone who has just been described accurately from the outside, who is hearing a precise account of something he has been doing without knowing he was doing it. And the hearing produced in me the same feeling that the rejection of the novel had not yet produced, the rejection being still 16 years in the future, which is the feeling of the exposure happening, of the interior being out in the world and the world responding to it. And the world in this case was Margaret. And her response was not the catastrophe I had been protecting myself from, but something considerably more difficult, which was a clear-eyed and loving description of the cost of the protection. The conversation changed things, not immediately and not completely, because the patterns of 30 years do not reverse in a single conversation, but the conversation was the beginning of a different quality of marriage, the beginning of my bringing the interior forward rather than keeping it in the waiting place, and the bringing forward was, as I had feared, exposing, and the exposure was, as I had not allowed Miss to believe, survivable, was not only survivable, but was the mechanism by which the marriage became. In the years after that conversation, the thing it had been capable of being, from the beginning, and that the waiting had prevented it. From being, I want to trace the pattern in only more place before I tell you what I understand the pattern to have been for, because the tracing is the honest work, and I want to do it honestly. The third place where the waiting showed itself most clearly was in their relationship with my sons. I have 3 sons, Matthew and James and the youngest, Andrew, and I was a present and reliable father to all of them in the functional sense, was at the games and the performances and the important occasions, was available in the practical way that available means when you are a father who shows up. And I was not available in the specific interior way that I was also not available in the marriage, the way that requires the bringing of the actual self rather than the reliable and competent version of the self. And the not availability in that specific way had costs that my sons have articulated to me at various points across their adult lives with the honest eye that adult children can sometimes bring to the accounting of their childhood experience when enough time has passed. Matthew told me something when he was in his mid-30s that I think about more than almost anything else any of my sons has said. He told me that when he was growing up, he always felt safe with me, and never felt quite known by me, and that the combination of those two things had produced in him, across his childhood and early adult life, a persistent uncertainty about whether he was interesting, whether the interior of who he was worth the bringing forward, whether the reliable and competent presentation was sufficient, or whether there was something further that should be attempted and that he hadn't been shown how to attempt. He was not blaming me. He said that explicitly, and I believe the explicitness was genuine and not diplomatic. He was describing what he had absorbed from the model I had provided, and what he had absorbed was the same thing I had absorbed from my father, the careful man, and what I had absorbed from my father had produced the waiting, and the waiting had produced, in Matthew, the same uncertainty about the interior's worth that had organized my own interior. Life for 30 years, before Margaret named it, the pattern had traveled. That is what Matthew was telling me, without knowing he was telling me, without having full account of where the pattern had come from or what its mechanism was. The pattern had traveled from my father to me to my son, not as a lesson taught but as a disposition demonstrated, as the lived and daily example of how a thoughtful man relates to the most interior and most genuine parts of himself, which in my family, across 3 generations, was to keep them in the waiting place where they were safe from the exposure that bringing them forward would require. I want to tell you now what you understand the waiting to have been for, because the tracing of the pattern across the professional life and the marriage and the fathering has been the preparation for this, has been the accumulation of evidence that the understanding requires. The waiting was protection. I have said that, but I want to be specific about what it was protecting me from, because the general statement that waiting is protective does not account for its specific, and the specific is what is most useful. What the waiting was protecting from was the experience of being fully present in my own life at the level of the actual interior, the experience of putting the most genuine and most vulnerable version of myself into the world and discovering what the world did with it. The novel could be rejected. The desire to write, fully acted on, could prove insufficient, could produce work that did not justify the desire, could demonstrate that the interior I had been protecting for 40 years wasn't as valuable as the protecting implied. Margaret could know me fully and find the knowing insufficient. My sons could receive the actual father, the interior one, and find him less than what the reliable and competent version had seemed to promise. These were the things I was waiting to feel ready for, and the readiness I was waiting for was the readiness to risk those outcomes. And the readiness never came, because a readiness of that kind is not available before the risking, is only available through the risking. And I had organized my entire life around the premise that the readiness was a prerequisite rather than a product, which meant the risking never happened, and the readiness never came, and the things I most genuine wanted to do and be remained in the waiting place for decade after decade, accruing the particular cost of things that could have been and were not. Thecos that I am doing the accounting of now at 80 years old. I submitted the novel in 2010, and it was rejected. I began writing in public in 2012, which for me meant a block that eventually found a small and genuine readership of people who were interested in the things I was interested in, and the writing in public produced, not the catastrophe I had been protecting myself from, but the specific and remarkable experience of being known by strangers for the actual interior rather than the reliable and competent presentation. And the experience was not comfortable exactly, but it was real. Was more real than most of the experiences I had spent 70 years accumulating in the waiting place. I published a collection of essays in 2018 at the age of 74, 40 years after I had first understood myself to be a writer, and the collection was read by a few thousand people and was, by any commercial measure, a modest thing, and it was, by the only measure I am now able to apply honestly, the most satisfying thing I have done in my professional life, not because of what it produced in the world, but because of what it required of me, which was the bringing forward of the interior at full strength without the waiting place to put it in. And the experience of that bringing forward and its survival was the evidence, finally and at 74, that the exposure I had been protecting myself from for 40 years was survivable, had always been survivable, and that protection had cost considerably more than the exposure would have. I'm 80 years old, and I am still writing, and I am in a marriage that has been genuinely different in the quality of its interior presence since 1994, and I have relationships with Mysons that include, increasingly, and with the imperfection that increasing always involves, the actual father rather than only the reliable and competent version. And I am not telling you any of this as a success story, because the accounting of what the waiting cost is not a story that has a triumphant ending, is simply a story that has a more honest ending than it would have had if I had continued the waiting until there was no more time for anything else. What I want to say to you directly, from 80 years and from inside the understanding that took 78 of them to arrive at, is that the readiness you are waiting for is not coming, not because you are not capable of the thing you are waiting to feel ready for, but because readiness of the specific kind that the waiting requires is not available before the doing and is only available through the doing. And the doing requires the bringing of the interior forward into the exposure that the waiting is protecting you from. And the exposure, whatever it produces, will not be the catastrophe that the protection implies. The thing you are most waiting to feel ready for is almost certainly the thing that is most genuinely yours. The thing closest to the actual interior, the thing whose failure would feel most like a verdict on the self, rather than simply a failure of preparation or application. And it is closest to the actual interior because it is the most real thing, the most genuinely continuous with who you actually are. And the proximity to the actual interior is both what makes it most worth doing and most frightening to attempt. And the fear of the attempt is what the waiting is for. And the waiting will protect you from the attempt until there is no more time for the attempt. And at that point, the protection will reveal itself as what it was, which is the long and comfortable and ultimately very expensive avoidance of the most genuine version of your own life. I am 80 years old. I haven't been waiting my entire life to feel ready. I have never felt ready. I have done some of the things anyway, later than I should have, and imperfectly, and at the cost of the years the waiting consumed. And the doing of them has been worth of everything the waiting was trying to prevent. And I wish, with the specific and honest grief of someone who knows the difference between wishing and changing, that I had understood this at 30 rather than at 78, that I had understood the waiting for what it was early enough to do something different with, the years that the understanding would have freed. You still have those years. That is what I want to leave you with, not as comfort, because I am not interested in comfort that softens what needs to be felt clearly, but as fact. If you are not 80, if you are reading this from somewhere earlier in the life that I am looking back on from this distance, you have the years that I spent waiting. You have the actual time. The readiness is not coming, and the thing you are waiting to feel ready for is not going to become less frightening with further preparation. And the only movement available from where you are standing is forward, into the doing, into the exposure, into the experience of putting the most genuine and most interior version of yourself into the world, and finding out what the world does with it. What the world does with it. Will it destroy you? I can tell you that from 80 years of being afraid that it would. The world's response to the interior, whatever it is information. And information is not the catastrophe that the waiting implies. And the self that produces the thing you most genuinely want to produce is not diminished by the world's response to it, but is, in the producing and the exposure, more fully present in its own life than it was in the waiting place. And the presence imperfect and exposed and no longer protected, is the thing the waiting was always preventing, and the thing that was always underneath the protection. What you were actually waiting for, that is what I was waiting for. Not readiness, presence, my own presence in my own life at the full and unprotected depth of it. And the waiting was the long way around to understanding that presence is not a destination, that preparation produces Buddha condition, that only the doing, the actual and exposed and interior forwarding can provide. I am here now, imperfectly and 80 years in, and with the full accounting of the cost of the route I took. But here, finally, and without the waiting place, actually here. You do not have to take this long to arrive.